housekeeping things. Standing on the wall. Next month, Alan Coursey, manager of BIG, is going to be talking to us about his vision for what's going to happen to Stratford, basically. I hope he's got some ideas, so he'll be telling us all about that. At the back there's some leaflets and things about Big Green Week. There's still a bike ride on the Greenway coming, so if you can do that, if you can stay upright on the Greenway. And there's also some leaflets about the new arts hub at the Brook in Sheffield. So I think that's about it. Okay, so Paul Hirons is going to talk to us about Mervyn Peake's Gormenghast, about which I must confess I know absolutely nothing, so I'm looking forward to it.
Neither do I.
Making it up as it goes along, like we all do. Okay, thank you very much, Paul.
Sorry for the technical problems at the start there. Nothing to do with me, of course. If you want to come a bit closer, feel free. If you want to stay at the back, I'll shout. That's okay. Who's heard of Mervyn Peake? Okay. Who's heard of Gormenghast?
Not till a fortnight ago.
Who's seen the fantastic 2000 series that the BBC put on Gormenghast? Okay. By the way, all of the books are on here for you to look at later. This is a DVD set. Fantastic. I'm hoping to show you a clip from this at the end. The technical stuff was trying to get us to show you a clip, which would have plunged you into a world of complex ritual carried out within the confines of Gormenghast Castle, a gigantic labyrinth of crumbling stone and mortar, populated by a motley crew of dark Dickensian characters. I won't read the rest of it just in case we can't get it set up at the end. Okay, so Mervyn Peake, I'm going to be dealing with his fiction that he wrote, fantasy fiction, I guess you'd call it. But Peake was a polymath, and in his short life, he did everything, basically. So if we could have a look at the next slide. During the 1940s and 50s, Mervyn Peake, so he was a painter, an illustrator, playwright, a poet, a novelist, and he created Titus Groan. So everyone knows these books as the Gormenghast trilogy. Okay, it's actually about Titus Groan, the 77th Earl of Gormenghast, and it's a big fat book, Titus Groan, the first in the series. Many hundreds of pages, and at the end of Titus Groan is 1 year old. Okay? When we start the second book, Gormenghast is actually in school. Okay? And the second book, Gormenghast, is all about a character called Steerpike. And Steerpike is an arch villain, and we'll hear a little bit about him later on. It's about the rise and fall of Steerpike. Okay, Titus Groan is the protagonist. Steerpike is definitely the antagonist of that second book. And then in the third book, Titus Alone, Titus Groan actually leaves the confines of Gormenghast and ventures out into a world. But because it's Mervyn Peake's world, it's a world of the imagination. And there are some dark and dreadful places in that last book. And you'll see why when I speak about it later. He did other things, including this book, Boy in Darkness, which is actually about Titus Groan, although it talks about the boy all the way through. And then there's a book here which I'll talk about right at the end. And then if you want to learn more about Mervyn Peake, there's a beautiful book called Vast Alchemies. Now, caution here, I'm not sure this is still in print. Okay, but plenty of second-hand versions of it available. If you want to know more about Peake, read this book. It is brilliant. Okay. Unforgettable cast of grotesque characters, think Dickensian. Okay. Welcome to his world. Titus Groan was the first book, as I mentioned, about Peake's early life and times. Well, let's talk about those early life and times. He was born in 1911. He was born in China, believe it or not. His mother and father were Christian missionaries. His father was a doctor. And his mum's ill health forced him to return to England in 1923. So his first 12 years were spent in China. And actually, you can see some of these Chinese experiences coming through in those books. It's a shame we couldn't see the BBC extract because the shots of Gormenghast are very Chinese, it seems to me. So he picked up that from his time in China. So, influences: the walled city of Wushang. And you could suggest that he got the whole edifice of Gormenghast and the Groan dynasty from China. And whilst around this time, the boy emperor had to resign when China became a republic. And this is something I didn't realise until I actually did the research on it. So the other thing about China was there were biblical floods, really biblical floods, at a place called Tianjin. In Tianjin, periodically the whole city would be flooded to the depths of God knows how many meters. Anyway, precocious signs of artistic promise in the young Peake. Mervyn simply drew all the time. He hardly ever looked up from the table. A most extraordinary little boy. And then his mother wanted to clear the table. And he was most indignant when he had to take away all these scraps of paper on which he was drawing. And the moment tea was over, he was back there again with them. It was difficult to get him to bed simply because he stuck to this drawing. So from an early age, he was an artist. When he came back to England, he went to Elton College, which I was told the last time I did this, that Elton College is a college that's popular with missionaries and people who are working abroad and have to put their kids into a private school while they're abroad. He wasn't a great scholar, and he left in 1929. And then there was a series of art schools. And Croydon Art School of Art was the first one. Then the Royal Academy. He had he was on a 5-year diploma course at the Royal Academy. He wasn't the first student to be worn down by endless copying. Various exhibitions he put on, plus costume design for a play called the Insect Play. And he abandoned the course when a small channel island hove into view. Not literally, of course. It was called Sark. And he got involved with a guy who wanted to set up a gallery, an art gallery, on Sark. And he actually pitched in with a group of people and helped build the new gallery and provided paintings and drawings for the first exhibition in 1933. He stayed on the island and he took a small live-in studio. There were many small exhibitions. Lots of his paintings were on exhibition, but tensions arose within the community. He left Sark under a cloud, apparently. Mervyn claimed that his departure was caused by the Dane. The Dane was this big, upstanding mayor-type figure on Sark. An old man had died and was laid out in Sark's little chapel with 4 tall white candles, his white beard spreading over the white cloth that covered him. Mervyn could not resist the temptation to draw it and slipped in during the night, only to be discovered and asked to leave the island. He got married, and he got married to a very special person called Maeve Gilmore. And Maeve Gilmore was a fellow artist. In fact, Mervyn did some teaching, and Maeve was one of his students. So it was a bit naughty of the teacher, really. But he met his future wife in 1936, and he was teaching at Westminster School of Art. She was smitten. How smitten? Here was the perfect Byronic romantic figure, jet black hair bursting upwards from a high forehead and a long narrow face, in which were embedded bright blue eyes and sharply cut incisions on either side of a full yet narrow and sensitive mouth. And by the time she went home from the Lions Corner House Cafe, she was in love for life. How about that? So Maeve's family were comfortably off, and Mervyn was not initially popular with her parents. So much so that they packed her off to Germany to study, hoping the relationship would cool. It didn't. Mervyn mentioned almost in passing that he was going to be married in 2 months' time, and this was proffered by someone who had been accepted as a kind of perpetual Don Juan. It was an equal surprise to hear that the woman chosen was also a student at the Westminster, but not known to anyone in the life class because she worked quietly downstairs in Eric Shilsky's sculpture class, and no one upstairs had apparently either seen her or, at least of all, seen Mervyn with her. So it goes. They were married in December 1937. First child, Sebastian, was born in January 1940. 1940, you say? Well, Second World War. And my next subject matter is Peake's, what I call Peake's Inglorious War. And it was a relentless battle by Peake to be recognised as an official war artist. But lots of other artists were being appointed as official war artists. And despite friends in high places, e.g. Sir Kenneth Clarke, this was not rewarded for 2 years. Meanwhile, Mervyn found soldiering hard work, and the Royal Artillery found it impossible to make use of him, moving him from pillar to post. He carried on with his drawing. He published a number of illustrated poetry books for children, including Rider Cock Horse, Wartime Shortages of basic materials hindered the quality and restricted the quantity of these books, which actually sold quite well. So a shortage of paper, shortage of ink, shortage of everything during the Second World War. April 1942, second son born, Fabian. 27th of May 1942, he suffers a nervous breakdown and is admitted to Southport Emergency Hospital, followed by sick leave until the end of 1942. Book illustrations for The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, published in 1943, moved to the Ministry of Information, which made better use of his skills. In 1945, he visited Belsen, and he was there to produce drawings of the inmates alongside a reporter. A lot of people think that this affected him in some way. He was affected by the experience, but it didn't destroy him, as some commentators have alluded to. Why am I talking to you about World War II? Well, throughout World War II, he wrote Titus Groan. And Titus Groan is the first book in the series. This one. And it took him throughout the war from 1940 to 1946 to write it. Was squeezed in around his army duties, such as they were. Graham Greene, another friend in high places, didn't like an early draft. And I'll read you a little bit from his comments on that draft. Dear Mervyn Peake, you must forgive me for not having written before, but you know it's a long book. I'm going to be mercilessly frank. I was very disappointed in a lot of it and frequently wanted to wring your neck because it seems to me you were spoiling a first-class book by laziness. The part I'd seen before, I of course had liked immensely, though I'm not sure it gained by the loss of the prologue. Then it seemed to me one entered a long patch of really bad writing, with redundant adjectives, a kind of facetiousness, a terrible prolixity. Does anyone know what prolixity means? Yeah. Answers on the postcard. In a dialogue of such characters as the nurse and prune squalor, and sentimentality too in the case of Ida or Edna, and to some extent in Titus's sister, Fuchsia. In fact, frankly again, I began to despair of the book altogether. Now, I'm a writer in my spare time, and that chimes with me. Because he didn't spare him in that review. Okay, I'm going to read a little bit from Titus Groan, only a little bit. It's from the start. The Hall of Bright Carvings. Gormenghast, that is, the main massing of the original stone, taken by itself, would have displayed a certain ponderous architectural quality, were it possible to have ignored the circumfusion of those mean dwellings that swarmed like an epidemic around its outer walls. They sprawled over the sloping earth, each one halfway over its neighbour, until, held back by the castle ramparts, the innermost of these hovels laid hold on the great walls, clamping themselves thereto like limpets to a rock. These dwellings, by ancient law, were granted this chill intimacy with the stronghold that loomed above them. Over their irregular roofs would fall throughout the seasons the shadows of time-eaten buttresses, of broken and lofty turrets, and, most enormous of all, the shadow of the Tower of Flints. This tower, patched unevenly with black ivy, arose like a mutilated finger from among the fists of knuckled masonry and pointed blasphemously at heaven. At night, the owls made of it an echoing throat. By day, it stood voiceless and cast its long shadow. Welcome to Gormenghast. That's the opening paragraph. So it paints a picture for you, doesn't it? Paints a picture. He was a painter, and he was painting there using words. It got a mixed reception from the reviewers. It sold out its initial print run of 2000, but was remaindered after the reprint. Didn't get into paperback until 1968, which was too late for Mervyn. Okay, slide 2, please. So I'm focusing, I've given you a little bit of biography of Peake, but I'm moving on now to the second book in the series, Gormenghast. During 1946 to 49, he returned to Sark, and whilst he was on Sark, he stayed for 3 years, he wrote Gormenghast, which was eventually published in 1950. He was backwards and forwards from Sark. He didn't stay there all the time. He taught in London, and sometimes he appeared on the radio as well. His daughter Claire was born in May 1949. The 1950s, it was a double-edged sword for him, really, because he was very successful in the early 50s, but as his illness took hold, which I'll talk about in a minute, it was a steady decline. So not only did he publish Gormenghast, but he published something called The Glass Blowers, which was a volume of his poetry. And it was when, during the war, he actually visited a local factory which were producing valves for the new radar sets. And I think it was called Mullards. And these glass blowers were highly skilled people, and they blow I think most of you probably know what a valve looks like, old-fashioned valve. So it was about that really, and Gormenghast. So in 1951, he got awarded his only ever award for writing, and it was the 1951 W.H. Heinemann Award, and it was awarded for the Glass Blowers and Gormenghast. He and Maeve blew the money on a holiday in France. And if you're looking for the W.H. Heinemann Award, it no longer exists. Okay. As the decade wore on, he was increasingly affected by the debilitating effects of his illness. There were radio adaptations of Titus Groan and Mr. Pye, which was a book he wrote later on. And he wrote several plays as well. He became obsessed by a play he developed called To Wit, To Woo. That's the sort of play that you got in the 1950s, unfortunately, which had a very brief run at the Arts Theatre in 1957, I'm told. He continued to struggle with illness. Okay, what sort of illness was this? He was originally diagnosed as Parkinson's, but was then diagnosed as early onset senile dementia, and so on. The condition was poorly understood, okay? But it was an early onset dementia that he was suffering from, and it got worse. By 1959, and the publication of Titus alone, his creative life was effectively over. So let's have a look at book 2, Gormenghast. And I'll tell you a little bit of what it was about. Gormenghast covers the period of Titus's life between the ages of 6 and 18. His schooling, his escapades and punishments, and his simultaneous discovery of his identity and love. He falls for Keda's daughter, now a wild girl in the woods, but hardly has he held her in his arms when she is killed by lightning. Ultimately, he prepares to commit the unthinkable in leaving Gormenghast to find out what lies beyond its horizons. Steerpike, who has killed Nanny Slag, drowned another master of ritual and starved the twins to death, has risen to become master of ritual himself, and he attempts to seduce Fuchsia. But Lady Groan suspects him of foul play, and the exiled Flay, continuing to make surreptitious visits to the castle, joins Dr. Pruneswaller in unmasking him, and so on. So it's quite a story, okay? And certainly on the film, it says 6 murders, 2 seductions, and 3 tragic deaths. Who will rule Gormenghast? Okay, in 1953, he wrote a book called Mr. Pye, a different kind of book to the Gormenghast novels. It was based on Sark. Okay, so Sark is a big part of Peake's life and times. And many of the characters were taken from life. So everyone had great fun on Sark, trying to recognise themselves in this tale. Unfortunately, like his previous books, it did not sell well and was remaindered. It was dramatised by Channel 4 and broadcast in 1986. I don't know if any of you remember this at all. Yeah? And it starred Derek Jacobi, no less, as Mr. Pye. Now, it's still available on YouTube, but I couldn't find a copy that actually was any good. So good luck with it. And then I think I mentioned the book called Boy in Darkness, which was published in 1956, which was the year I was born, actually. Mervyn Peake wrote this as Titus Groan's first escape from Gormenghast. So it was written before Titus alone was third of the book. It's an oddity. It was originally a novella that was published in Sometime Never, 3 Tales of Imagination. The other contributions were from William Golding and John Wyndham, so quite illustrious people. And it's published in its own right as a rather scary children's book in 1996. Features the first escape of Titus from Gormenghast and is touted as an early example of magical realism in the literary world. On to book 3, which was published in 1959, the final book in the Gormenghast trilogy, written during a significant decline in his mental health. It's where Titus Groan finally escapes from the suffocating ritual of Gormenghast and experiences the world outside, a world utterly removed from Gormenghast, featuring the haunting Underriver. And I mention the Underriver because it's quite redolent of his experiences when he was in that terrible place, Belsen, at the end of the Second World War. So if I can just read a little bit from this one. Titus alone. It's where he first enters the underworld, the Underriver, sorry. For all the noise of water overhead, there was silence also. For all the murk, there were the shreds of light. For all the jostling and squalor, there were also the great spaces and profound withdrawal. Long fleets of tables were like rafts with legs, or like a market, for there were figures seated at these tables with crates and sacks before them, or at their sides, or heaped together on the damp ground. A sodden and pathetic salvage, telling of other days in other lands. Days when hopes bubble, bobbing in their breasts, forgot who have not heard of disillusion. Days of bravado, gold days and green days, and so on. And this is all taking place in a place of darkness underneath a big river. But there were no doctors and there was no authority, and the sick were free to leap among the shadows and soar with their own fever, and the hale were free to spend their days in bed, curled up like cats, or at full stretch, rigid as men in armour. And this book is quite a sad book, really, in that he was, a decline, suffering from dementia, whilst he was writing this book. After he'd written this book, there was very little else that he produced. No, I'm still on that one. Not well received, damned with faint praise. And then came the 1960s. A cruel and heartbreaking descent into illness and premature death. In 1965, he was admitted into the Priory at Roehampton, a private psychiatric hospital where he stayed for 3 years. In 1966, the Titus books were released as modern classics, generating income to pay for the Priory, which was hellishly expensive. Also released in America as a follow-on to The Lord of the Rings. After a few months in a home for the terminally ill, Mervyn Peake died, aged 57. A line from one of his poems was carved on his gravestone. To live at all is miracle enough. So what was Peake's legacy? In 1972, Maeve, his wife, wrote a memoir called The World Away, and that was published. Paperback editions of the Titus books, 1986, Mr. Pye, broadcast by Channel 4, 2000, the BBC adaptation of Titus Groan and Gormenghast broadcast, significant DVD sales. Unfortunately, 32 years after he died. Various biographical works, including this one, Vast Alchemies, a landmark body of work. And just before I go on to my last piece of this, with Gormenghast, Mervyn built a new edifice in the landscape of the literary imagination, a landmark by which other writers now situate themselves and are situated by others. Its influence on other writers is often subliminal rather than explicitly acknowledged. Walking on Glass by Ian Banks, however, features an uncannily Gormenghast Castle. In this edifice, even a table leg proves to be made of compressed books, comprising Titus Groan and others. In short, Mervyn Peake's work has become part of the fabric of world literature. He is now acknowledged by the Encyclopedia of Fantasy as the most potent visionary the field has yet witnessed. For all the tragedy of his last years, Mervyn triumphed in the end. However, there's one last piece of this. Next slide. Right. Titus Awakes, which was published in 2011. And here's the book. And it was actually read out as a book of the week on Radio 4. Peake had planned to move on with a fourth book in the Titus series called Titus Awakes. We got no further than an opening fragment and a chapter listing with one-word titles. So the opening fragment starts this book. Starting with the fragments, his widow, Maid Gilmore, put together a final Titus book and prepared it for publication. When she died in 1983, it was lost for decades. The draft was found by her daughter in a cardboard box in the family attic. The finished book was a tribute to her late husband and his narrative style, and a fitting and moving conclusion to the story. The story ends on Sark, again, where Titus is joined by a tall, dark, urgent man as they leave the jetty. Obviously, Mervyn Peake. And I'll just read out that last bit. So, in this fiction, Titus, the imaginary character, meets Mervyn Peake, the author, long dead. They left the wall and watched as suitcases, provisions, and all the sundry necessities of island life were unloaded. The man, tall, dark, urgent, hoisted a little girl on his back. Titus had reached an anchorage. He knew that his past and his future, his whole being, his reason, were here. As he began to walk away from the jetty through the small tunnel hacked out of the rock, he was joined by the man and his children. Together, they made their way up the steep hill. Titus no longer felt alone, but a part of someone who would shape his life to come. There's not a road, not a track, but it will lead him home. And there it is, a brief trip through Mervyn Peake and Gormenghast books. And the last slide says, have you got any questions? I will only accept questions that I can answer. Sorry, I think the lady to your right was first.
I wanted to come this evening because the Gormenghast trilogy is a book that I read in my early 20s,
Okay.
which has stayed as a whole series of searing images,
Yes,
which I can visit whenever I want to.
yes,
It's just amazing,
unforgettable.
unforgettable. And I did actually take Gormenghast into the hospital with me when I had my first son, because I was going to have some time on my hands. So I thought I could actually read it fairly quickly. However, I had reader's block for about a year.
Okay.
So I didn't read it until he was a year old. It's a fantastic book. Anybody really
Do you still have the book?
Fantastic.
Do you still have the book?
Sorry?
Do you still have the book?
Yes.
Yes. I would recommend trying to get hold of this one, which is Titus Awakes, because it's a really, although it was written by Maeve,
Yeah.
It's a really
I don't know.
interesting postscript to it.
I shall go to Waterstones tomorrow.
Yes, it'd be good for you.
You started off reading a passage from Titus Groan, the first book. I closed my eyes. I could have sworn it was Terry Pratchett writing about Discworld.
Yes.
It just sounded straight out of one of the Pratchett books.
Yeah.
So I presume that he was greatly influenced by.
I presume it was. My ex-wife was a big Terry Pratchett fan, so I got her cast-offs, and I got to like Terry Pratchett as well. But I never made the connection. So good for you.
Really? Gosh.
No. But yeah, it's that tradition really, and certainly Michael Moorcock, a big fantasy writer, was instrumental in sort of bringing Mervyn Peake back to everyone's sort of knowledge, and he pushed it. Michael Moorcock was a fantasy writer, and he I think he's dead now, and he did omnibus editions of short stories and all that sort of stuff. And he had no compunction in pushing Mervyn Peake as a fantasy writer. Yeah.
So another question. You said that when Peake was younger, he was obsessed by illustration, and he followed a path into art school. So two questions. Firstly, you didn't show any illustrations at all.
I did not.
Not a lot.
No.
And second,
Yeah.
he wasn't educated as a writer. He didn't do literature or creative writing or any of the courses he might have done.
No.
And so maybe Graham Greene was quite right to be so critical.
I think he was. I think he was being cruel to be kind. To answer that question, Graham Greene. He could see what Peake was trying to produce here, but he let himself down by his, I suppose you call it over elaborate writing, and his Dickensian scenes and so on and so forth. So sometimes, I don't know if you found this, you can be in a scene and you want the scene to finish in a reasonable amount of time, but the descriptions just go on and on and on. So maybe that's where Graham Greene was coming from. As far as the illustrations are concerned, which is a big part of his life, didn't have time, basically. So I had to constrain this talk to his fiction. Yeah, but he did have a parallel career in book illustration and was much loved as a book illustrator. But if you come out here and have a look at the illustrations in this, you'll find that it's all of his drawings, they're never far from the grotesque. So even some of the 500 or so drawings he did of his wife, there's an element of grotesque to it. So if you see a photograph of his wife and Peake's sort of drawing next to it, you think, oh gosh, wow. So the macabre and
who were his inspirations in the past? Was it Rackham or?
I think it was probably the people. It was Rackham, the Alice in Wonderland guy. Or?
No, it's Tenniel.
Yeah.
No, Rackham was around the turn of the century.
Yeah.
Quite grotesque like that.
Yeah. I would say he goes back in. He's part of that line of famous illustrators. Started, I think, by Tenniel back then, and I think he's in that sort of pantheon, if you like. Book illustrators. Book illustrations, they're they're not very much in vogue these days, to be honest. But there was a living to be made from. But don't forget, he was a polymath. So when he came to writing, he said, "Well, I can do that," and so he wrote. Thank you. Any more questions? One from the back.
But I recall, I'd say I did not mean that, but a friend of mine was terribly fond of his books, and I remember the covers certainly being very bold and grotesque. Weren't they his illustrations?
No,
They were.
no, not as far as I know. No.
Odd.
Which is odd, isn't it? But his illustrations are inside.
But not the
Yeah.
cover.
No. So I think your 3-volume omnibus edition, the trilogy, would have illustrations in it.
Spotty's one was the publisher.
Yeah, Spottis would.
Spotty's wood.
Yeah. Yeah.
Very nice paper. Thank you.
Okay, any more questions? The books are here for you to have a quick look at afterwards, so